All right, everyone, welcome. This is going to be the first lecture for the democracy class. This is chapter two of Robert Dahl's On Democracy. Where and how did democracy develop? Dahl is a very, very famous political theorist, and his writings go all the way back to like the 1960s or something. I mean, this dude has been doing it forever. All right, so we'll jump right into section one, the introduction. Um, assuming that democracy has been on sort of a linear path since Athens is just incorrect, right? Um, we had Athens, we had Rome, uh, uh, the Roman democracy, at least before Julius Caesar. But then democracy disappeared basically from the earth for 1,000 years or more, especially on sort of a developed level, right? You probably had some like tribal or local democratic functions, right? That's almost inevitable. That's usually how a lot of very localized tribal systems tend to work. Um, but on a mass scale, on even a city-wide scale or a statewide scale, especially, democracy disappeared for a millennium. And so if you look at figure one, which is called democratic countries, those with male or full suffrage, you can see the proportion of states that were democratic has increased over the last 100 years or so, though we are in a falling back period again right now, where democracy is sort of collapsing around the planet. But you can see that democracy has never been the majority of states. And I even think that Dahl here is being very kind by calling certain states, especially in the 1800s, democracies, as they would never qualify today under our common rules of what a democracy is, including free speech, free association, freedom of the press, free and fair elections, and full universal suffrage. So most democratic theories say America itself was not a democracy until 1965 when the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act was passed and blacks and minorities were finally allowed to vote in the United States, unless you were a felon in certain cases. But that was the first time that America became a full fledged democracy in 1965 when we got universal suffrage, right? And one of the authors that we'll read later in the semester, Adam Jaworski, is pretty adamant about this himself. He just flat out refuses to say that that America was a democracy pre 1965. That means Switzerland wasn't a democracy until 1972 when they allowed women to vote, right? And so without full universal suffrage, this graph would look very, very different, right? Okay. Moving on, Athens, right, is widely considered to be the world's first democracy, right, on a very small scale and a very weirdly different system than we have today. There weren't elections. You drew straws, and citizens were randomly chosen to participate in the assembly, right? And so there were not elections, and we'll talk a little bit about that later too. Rome later became a democracy until Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon um, and basically took over the state. And then, especially after his murder by the senators, democracy was dead in Rome. And democracy did not return, arguably, until maybe the early 1500s with Poland. Some say the early 1600s with the English Parliament. But there were 1,500 years or so where there really was no democratic system, again, outside the very small, isolated local systems. Um, again, as mentioned in that graph, a lot of those states would not count today. A lot of people criticize Dahl for counting some of those states with, say, a 2 to 5% elitist, aristocratic male voting system, right? You had to be, even in America, you had to be landowning, you had to not only own the land, but you have to have improved the land and put on some sort of like building or something like that, or built out a farm, etc. You had to be male. Generally, you had to be literate. Um, and so, you know, the modern parlance of democracy, of full suffrage, free and fair elections, just did not exist. We were also a slave society, right? We, at least until 1865-ish, when we passed the Civil Rights Act, not the Civil Rights Act, the 14th and 15th Amendment, post-Civil War amendments, we were a slave society, and there was a very short period of Reconstruction where the carpetbaggers from the North went south and tried to sort of enforce these new labor laws and things of that sort, but it was a very short lived project. The North abandoned this shortly thereafter. And then we get the Jim Crow period in the United States, where we have tyranny and terrorism against Black citizens, lynchings, and literally like lynching festivals, where like there'd be a parade and a festival all revolving around lynching Black people. And so like these are deep considerations that need to be thought about before ever saying yes, America was a democracy since its founding, right? And so let's see. Oh, Dahl says democracy has been invented multiple times and in multiple places in isolation. So democracy is almost natural when the preconditions exist for it to flourish, right? Um, Contemporaneously, democracies have spread through what we call sort of learning diffusion, where states just sort of copy what they see from other states, et cetera. But early in the transition, or early, in our human history, especially in after the 0 year, um, democracy popped up in a couple different places, and independently of each other. They didn't really know the other was doing this, right? And so it sort of offers a little bit of hope that democracy isn't as difficult to implement as some think it is. And it is. Like, we'll get into that too. Dahl also theorizes that there are very particularized conditions that allow democracy to pop up nearly naturally, right? Especially at a small scale. And a couple of these involve little outside influence, but also seeing other members of your society as equals, right? There's this logic of equality. We all have the same right to govern ourselves. Or oh my goodness, excuse me. We all have the right to govern ourselves, or at least have input in how things are run and how we are governed, right? And some other theorists have since added things like a middle class, right? You have to have a middle class to have a flourishing democracy. If you only have the rich versus the poor, and there's this huge inequality gap that is very bad for democracy. Um, let's see. All right, we'll go to the next section. He talks about a few places where democracy popped up over time. So obviously the Mediterranean with Greece and Rome. The Greek democracy kicked off around 507 BC. This was the assembly in Athens, right? These were small city states. We didn't have the concept of the state yet. That doesn't really come until the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So instead, what we get is these city state setups, right? Very small localities. They generally had, fields outside of them with agriculture to feed the population. But numerous city states, Macedonia, Sparta, Peloponnesus, Athens, etc., had differing systems, right? um, Sparta had like a triumvirate king system, and their training of their young men for military needs. Athens, on the other hand, had an assembly, generally of about 500 citizens. They were chosen by random lot every few years. And there was a really good chance that every citizen, once at least in their lifetime, would eventually sit on the assembly. And so there were a very, very small handful of officials that were elected outright, like the military leaders, the general, these sorts of things. But for the most part, the assembly itself was chosen by random lottery. This setup, this lottery system of just your average citizen participating in governance has largely disappeared from the planet. But there are democratic theorists talking about returning this idea, right? Maybe to start out at the local level, but there are concerns that politicians have become so bought and paid for that we need to do something other than elections, right? Elections are popularity and money contests. It doesn't mean you're a good governor. You're good at like writing legislation. Uh, Sociopathic charisma and ultra wealth are very different skills, if you want to if you want to call them skills, than governing, right? And so there seems to be some sort of disconnect in the electoral established system that we use today, that doesn't necessarily bring good governing outcomes, right? Okay. The second one from the Mediterranean examples from section two is Rome, as we talked about, right? Rome also was a city state. So you had a whole bunch of little city states at the time, Venice, Rome, and others. Um, Rome's problem was that it overextended itself badly, right? This idea that every road leads to Rome, right? Um, from the flip side means that you extended yourself so far into Europe that you could never control all of these citizens, right? And one of the wonderful things about Rome is as they conquered new areas, which that's not wonderful, don't get me wrong, but once you were conquered, you were a full citizen, right? Um, but this full citizenship and the needs of citizens on the state started to really decline, right? Because you had to actually be in Rome. And so the Huns or others who could never get there, like financially or logistically, while they were told that they had political power and equal citizenship, they really didn't, right? And this started to cause real problems. And the decline happened around, 130 BC. And then it got even worse when Caesar crosses the Rubicon with the Roman military and basically takes over the Senate chamber, and then it just collapses completely after the senators all sort of stab Caesar together. Um, okay, next section, Italy, section three. So pseudo democracy starts to pop back up around 1100 AD, again around these Roman city states. This was mostly highly aristocratic and elitist at first, just like most modern democracies were to begin with. A very, very small percentage of the male population was allowed to vote. Um, but as as the merchant class starts to grow, as you get a new sort of guild and apprenticeship system, that's a mouthful. Um, it starts to force some demands from a growing middle class, which we kind of touched on earlier. Like you have to have a middle class to have democracy. And so this was forced open. The ability to participate by citizens was forced open more and more as a middle class starts to grow and have more and more power and more needs from the state. And they're saying, look, you're taking my tax money. That means I need to have a say in this, right? And that's usually how this sort of starts to play out as a rising middle class starts to tell the elites, look, we're sick of this. You want our taxes, then we want a voice, right? and it starts to crack open space in the system. And the elites basically have to say, okay, either we can oppress and repress and use violence against our middle class and our citizenry, or if we need our tax base to continue, or maybe like that's not going to work because they are a much bigger group than we are, then we will drip and drab little bits of political power to them, just as little as possible to keep them quiet, right? Okay, let's see. Democracy starts to decline again in Italy, right? We see these massive waves. And even in modern times, we see massive waves. We'll see democratization rising, and then we'll see it collapsing, and then we'll see it rise, and we'll see it collapsing. So we seem to be in like the third collapse of modern times, where we are back down on the downgrade of democracy and the upgrade of autocracy, dictatorship, competitive authoritarianism, whatever you want to call it. The nation state as a concept was growing, and the Italian city state system was unable to sort of compete. And in many ways, this led to the collapse of democracy in the Italian city states during that sort of, I don't know, dark ages, very short period of democratic flourishing. Okay, section 4, Northern Europe. So this is where we're getting into the more modern system. And what was missing from the ancient city state democracies? Dahl says basically three things, right? First, a national parliament. Second, elected representatives. And third, popularly chosen local governments that are subordinate to the national government, right? And so the city state the nation state starts to appear. And there are a couple reasons for this. One, again, you're getting a rising merchant class, the guild members, the apprenticeships, and especially the traders, right? The people who are in the shipping industry. Um, and so this is building out a new middle class yet again across Europe. The nation state system starts to appear in Britain, in Scandinavia, in the lowlands like the Netherlands, the Dutch, and then in Switzerland as well. At its most basic core, Dahl says, quote, in various localities, freemen and nobles would begin to participate directly in local assemblies. To these were added regional and national assemblies consisting of representatives, some or all of whom came to be elected. So again, like democracy is pretty easy at the local level, right? The problem is ramping it up. But as these states in Northern Europe and UK or whatever, um, they had they had this practice of talking it out at the local level, right? And in some sense, it became easier for them to take that practice because they already had some democratic habits and then ramp them up to the next level, right? To aggregate them to the regional level and then to the state level. You also had the need for many local kings and populations. What you really had was a two-layered system in Europe at that time, where you have a whole lot of local politics, and then you have the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church at this like giant competitive Europe continent-wide system. But you're missing that middle state system, right? And one way of pushing back against the Holy Roman Empire and against the Catholic Church in Rome uh, was to develop a state system, to aggregate the thoughts of your citizens, to create new professionalized militaries, all of these sorts of things which would allow them the power to push back against the church or the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so first we have local assemblies. Dahl uses the Vikings as an example, and they would show up to these local open assemblies called tings. We're going to talk about tings, right? Around 900 AD. So this is even before the Italian city states start to sort of develop democracy. They would discuss agriculture, the weather, the rules around the local community, fishery rights, disputes between families or clans, all of these sorts of things. They were still a rather hierarchical based system. They still practiced slavery and captured enslaved people. Um, However, the middle and lower classes, by definition, will always outnumber the upper class, right? And sometimes, like I discussed, when elites are in a tight spot, they really only have two decisions: either repress with violence or allow some political opening up, right? And this is a desperate choice, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that the elites actually talk about this, whether we should just kill the protesters, or is that going to make things worse? So maybe we should open up our political system a little bit. Okay, and then so we have the kings of the Vikings, and then about 100, 150 years later, we start to develop these assemblies at the local level, and we make regional or state level assemblies, right? And they start calling them, they call the old king, but we would call it like parliament today, or Congress, as we do in the United States, right? And so they're taking these practices from the local level, they're simply aggregating them, and then what they're doing is they're generally sending their best orator or strategist or whatever from their local king and sending them up to represent their region in the national parliament, right? And this same concept is sort of spreading across Northern Europe. So you've got Iceland doing this, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, etc. Again, you have these rising merchant classes. This is not only increasing the bargaining power of the common person, but also increasing sort of the tax leverage of the average citizen, saying, "Okay, you want my taxes, and you want to claim that you want to build out infrastructure or military apparatus or whatever it might be." Then I want something for it, right? You're not just going to take my money and I don't get anything for it, right? Um, and the kings at this point are becoming desperate for tax revenue, and they want to provide services, right? They want to build out infrastructure and roads so they can move their militaries around. They want to have a professionalized military with really excellent equipment so that they can fight off the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church and other states, etc. And so they need tax revenue, and this is usually what happens: is the elites have to decide, like, is repression worth it, or are we going to get more taxes by allowing a little bit of political opening up, right? Because if your elites just, I mean, not your elites, but if your merchant class just flees to another state, or they hide their assets, which is very easy to do in shipping, right, and trade, whereas agriculture and ranching are pretty easy, are difficult to hide. Then in some sense the king and the elites have to go, oh shit, we have to give something back if we're going to take from them, right? So this is very much like the Boston Tea Party idea: no taxation without representation, right? The idea wasn't actually no taxation. I mean, you have to pay taxes to a state, right? Like, we need services from a government. The problem was they didn't have a say, right? And so I think this gets misconstrued a little bit in American history, that it was just a revolt against taxes. That's not true. There were a couple other factors that were sort of leading to this new merchant class. We've touched on them a little bit. Rising agricultural technology, which allowed greater yields, all of these sorts of things, which again increases total revenues and profits. We had sort of the flourishing of banking across Europe. The church sort of opened up its own bank. The Templars had their own bank. There were a bunch of different banking systems across the continent. And then massive improvements in shipping technology, and then especially finding a way around the Horn of Africa and being able to take ships from Europe, right, the western coast of Europe, all the way around Africa and to India and Asia, before we had the Suez Canal that connected sort of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. And so this middle class is sort of exploding during this time. The English Parliament is also evolving at this time, right around 1270 during the reign of King Edward I. Um, but it's not as planned as some people sort of think it is. It was largely just a random number of responses that eventually spread or aggregated the power of the Parliament over time. The Parliament was very weak at first, right? And there were civil wars, the English Civil War, the Jacobins, and wars with Scotland and Ireland, and all kinds of things, right? And the real checks and balances and the real sort of lower House of Commons gaining power didn't really happen until maybe the 18th century. But we're seeing slight movements, right? Very small, slight movements, a little bit of political opening for the regular people. And it takes hundreds of years to get to where we are today. The checks and balances of the 18th century Parliament are sort of lauded by the U.S. framers, and this is in many ways why we set up the system that we did, especially following sort of the philosophies of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Um, Although they rejected the monarchical element of it, right? So they did take in a couple of ideas, though, like the independent judiciary, bicameralism, and it was kind of set up the same way England was, where they had in England you have the House of Lords, the elites and the nobles, and then you have the House of Commons. Well, the Senate was basically supposed to be like a House of Lords, right? It was supposed to be a very elitist institution to check the, how would I even say this? To check almost the communistic tendencies of the middle class, right? To be able to check and at least minimize the redistribution of wealth that our founders expected the House of Representatives would push because they were common people, right? We also put in constitutional norms and the idea of equal rights under the law, right? Due process, and all of these things. Again, it didn't play out. It still maybe isn't playing out fully, even today, right? Like, I question whether all Americans have equal rights, equal access, all of these sorts of things. But it has certainly improved since, 1776 when we declared independence. Okay, I think I'm going to pause it there and we'll cut this chapter in half. That way this lecture doesn't get too long. So again, this was chapter 2 from Dahl, and it was the first 4 sections of chapter 2. And we'll jump into the democratization section 5 next. All right, thanks for being here.